This week, the channel passed 400,000 subscribers, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for taking the time to comment on the videos, for subscribing to Briefcase, and for giving your feedback on the cases I cover. So today, I have put together a compilation of 5 cases where the verdicts or the final sentence caused some controversy, and some are still talked about today. The first case is from 1880s Australia. Louisa Collins was born on the 11th of August 1847 in Beltrees, very close to the small town of Scone in New South Wales, Australia. Her father, Henry, was originally from Birmingham in England and had been sent by the British courts to Australia in 1831. He left Portsmouth on the 16th of October on board the ship Asia, and along with 200 other men was transported to Australia to serve his punishment, arriving in Sydney on the 3rd of February 1832. Once his punishment was over, he stayed in Australia and married Catherine Ring, who had emigrated from Ireland with her family. When Louisa was 14 years old, her parents sent her to work as a domestic servant for a wealthy solicitor in the town of Merriwar. She worked hard and was treated well by her employer. She had always been a pretty child with long dark hair, and as she got older, she realised that men would pay her a lot of attention. This was something she found to be quite amusing and developed a very flirtatious nature. There were many men who wanted to court her, but when she was 18 years old, on the advice of her mother, she married Charles Andrews. He was well known in the community as he had worked for a long time as a butcher. Louisa's mother considered this to be a respectable match, as he had a steady income and could provide for her daughter. But Louisa was 13 years his junior, and while she still liked to dance and have fun, her husband wanted his wife to adopt a more traditional role. Over the next few years, Louisa gave birth to 9 children, 7 of whom survived infancy. Life was hard for her, and she missed the attention and compliments she used to receive from young men, and sometimes wished that she could escape from her daily grind of cleaning, washing, cooking, and looking after the children. At least her husband could leave the house to go to work. In 1886, the family moved and took up residence in the Sydney suburb of Botany. Charles thought that it would help the family finances if they took in lodgers. The children were older, so could help, but the added workload was difficult for Louisa. Her life had just become one of constant working. Her looks were fading, and she felt that life was passing her by. She had taken to drinking brandy and sometimes went to the pub. Although having lodgers in the house was hard, she liked the fact that they noticed her, and it didn't take long for her flirtatious nature to reappear. One of the lodgers was a young man named Michael Collins. He was a bold and self-confident character, and at every opportunity would try to spend time chatting to Louisa. He would tell her how young she looked and pay her compliments. Although Louisa liked the attention, her husband didn't, and considered the young man to be an ungrateful guest. Things came to a head in December 1886, when Charles confronted Michael Collins about the relationship with his wife. A scuffle followed, and the young man was evicted from their home. Less than 2 months later, Louisa's husband, Charles Andrews, became ill. He suffered from terrible stomach pains and was attended by a doctor named Dr. Martin. Dr. Martin was unsure exactly what was causing the sickness. He examined the patient and discussed his daily routine and his diet. He gave him medicine and said that he would call back in a few days. But Charles did not recover and passed away on the 2nd of February 1887. He was 53 years old. As so often was the case in the late 19th century, he had insured his life, and Louisa was the beneficiary of a small insurance policy. The circumstances surrounding his death were not considered suspicious, and Dr. Martin registered the death as due to gastritis. Louisa, however, was not a grieving widow. She was known to have told people that she found her husband to be a serious and somewhat boring character, with little time for fun and laughter, and after his death, neighbours were a little shocked. She did not dress herself in black and did not seem to mourn her husband's passing. Instead, she drank and went dancing with the man who had previously been lodging in her house, Michael Collins. On the 9th of April, 1887, just 2 months after Charles died, 39-year-old Louisa Andrews and 23-year-old Michael Collins were married. On her wedding day, she was 4 months pregnant with his child. They lived together in Popple's Terrace, Botany Road, in the Sydney suburb of Botany. Towards the end of 1887, Louisa gave birth to their child, a boy who they named John. Everything was going well until on the 10th of April, 1888, the baby, who was now 4.5 months old, became ill. They tried to nurse him, but by 10 p.m. he was continually crying. He was comforted by his mother and then eventually fell asleep, but he awoke an hour later, screaming and seemingly in a lot of pain, although neither of his parents considered calling for a doctor. Shortly before midnight, baby John died. When the doctor came to register the death, he questioned Louisa and Michael about the circumstances of the baby's demise. Louisa told him that he had been ill for 2 days and they had given him small amounts of castor oil, but his condition didn't improve. Dr. Martin was the doctor who had visited Louisa's first husband when he became ill and subsequently died. So as the death of her baby was so soon after, he instructed the couple to report the death to the police. He said that he would send a letter to the city coroner. At the time, the mortality rate in children under 5 years old in Australia was 19%, so the death of a baby was not uncommon. The coroner concluded that as there was no suspicious circumstances involved, it could be presumed that baby John Collins had died from natural causes, and it would not be necessary to hold an inquest. Louisa continued her daily routine of chores and looking after the 5 children that still resided in the house at Popple's Terrace. Michael returned to work as a wool washer, but soon started to feel unwell. A doctor named Dr. Marshall was called to examine him. He found his patient's symptoms somewhat curious and found it difficult to ascertain exactly what was causing Michael's illness. He visited the house a few times over the next 2 months, until on the 3rd of July, 1888, Michael's condition suddenly deteriorated. Dr. Marshall observed that Louisa was trying to comfort her husband, but he also noticed that she had been drinking. The following day, the 4th of July, when the doctor arrived at the house to check on his patient, he collected samples of urine and vomit. He also took a bottle of brandy and a medicine container that he found next to the bed. He conducted a rough analysis, but found nothing suspicious. 4 days later, on the 8th of July, Michael Collins died. Dr. Marshall informed Louisa that he was unable to issue a death certificate due to the circumstances of the death and would have to send a report to the city coroner. On receiving the report from Dr. Marshall and the fact that Louisa's first husband had also died quite suddenly, the coroner opened an inquest into the death of Michael Collins. At the inquest, evidence was presented confirming that the deceased received quite a few visitors in the weeks preceding his death. Many of these were concerned neighbours who called to assist Louisa. Dr. Marshall informed the inquest that he had asked Louisa to take Michael to hospital, but she replied that it would be better that he die at home. Dr. Marshall told her that he would be well cared for and there was no reason for him to die, but Louisa would not contemplate the notion. Half an hour after Michael's death, Constable Jeffers had arrived at the house and searched the property. He found a part-filled glass by the bed of the deceased. Its contents had been analysed and found to contain traces of arsenic. With this, the coroner concluded that the death of Michael Collins could be considered suspicious. The inquest had established that based on the symptoms of the illness and the results of the autopsy, the deceased had died from arsenic poisoning, possibly administered by his wife. On Saturday the 14th of July, 1888, the coroner opened a second inquest and issued a warrant to exhume the bodies of Charles Andrews and baby John Collins. Examinations found that the body of Charles Andrews contained faint traces of arsenic, but there were no traces found in the body of the child. The coroner decided that there was enough evidence to presume that both Charles Andrews and Michael Collins had been killed by arsenic poisoning, and Louisa Collins was charged with murder. The trial of Louisa Collins opened at the Supreme Court of New South Wales on the 6th of August 1888. The prosecution had decided to only charge her with the murder of her second husband, Michael Collins. Witnesses confirmed that she had nursed Michael, but had been drinking while doing so. Some told the court that although she cared for him, it felt that she was indifferent to his needs and sometimes seemed to be unemotional and somewhat detached. Dr. Marshall said that although Mrs. Collins refused to take her husband to hospital, the reluctance to take poorly relatives to hospital was not uncommon. He also said that although sometimes she seemed distant, on other occasions she was very caring and attentive towards her husband. He added that although he had initially thought that the deceased had died from gastritis, now he understands that arsenic was found in his body. He was sure that poisoning was the cause of death. In fact, 2 grams of arsenic was found in the body, and arsenic was also discovered in his vomit. Louisa had always maintained that she did not have any arsenic, and all she had given her husband was vomiting powder that she had bought from the local chemist in Botany Road. When the police visited the chemist, they were able to confirm this to be true, and any arsenic they had sold was traced and accounted for, none of which led back to Louisa. The prosecution called Louisa's daughter to the stand. Her name was May, and she was only 11 years old. She testified that her mother kept a box of rough-on rats in the kitchen. This was an arsenic-based poison used to kill unwanted rodents and commonplace in houses in the late 19th century. The defence reminded the court that Michael Collins did not have a life insurance policy, so in no way would Louisa benefit from his death. They also stated that the deceased worked in the wool washing industry, where workers could be exposed to arsenic. He was also taking some medication for a lump on his groin, and this may have contained arsenic, or he could have added some himself. The defence did manage to put an element of doubt into the case against Louisa. The prosecution continued to argue that the defendant was a ruthless woman, known as the Borstal of Botany Bay. They reminded the court that she had had an affair with the deceased when he had been a boarder in the family home she shared with her children and her first husband, who had also died in mysterious circumstances. She then married Michael Collins shortly after, before ridding herself of him when she lost interest in the marriage. When the trial ended, the judge did his summing up, and the jury retired to consider the case. 3.5 hours later, they returned and told the judge that they could not agree on a verdict. The judge asked them to go back and reconsider. On Thursday, the 9th of August 1888, they again returned, and the foreman informed the court that there was no possibility of an agreement, as they were split on the verdict. The judge then dismissed the jury. 3 months later, on the 5th of November, the second trial of Louisa Collins began. The same evidence was heard, but once again, the jury was split and unable to reach a verdict. When a jury was unable to reach a verdict after 2 trials, it was usual practice that the case against the defendant be dropped, but it was decided by the New South Wales courts that Louisa Collins should stand trial for the murder of her first husband, Charles Andrews. This trial commenced at the end of November. The prosecution told the court how after marrying the deceased at 18 years old and having 9 children, she grew tired of him when she met the young man Michael Collins, who was lodging at their property. But when her husband ejected him from their house and forbade his wife from seeing him, the defendant callously poisoned him. The defence, however, explained that the deceased would have had exposure to arsenic during his life, and after being buried, it was possible that arsenic may have entered his body through the soil or the coffin. They announced that it was impossible to establish beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant was responsible for her husband's death. When both the prosecution and the defence had presented their case, the jury was sent out to deliberate, but just like the previous 2 trials, they were unable to agree a verdict. Louisa Collins had now been tried 3 times, twice for the murder of her second husband, Michael Collins, and once for the murder of her first husband, Charles Andrews, and each one had resulted in a hung jury. The case had been widely reported in the newspapers, and just like the 3 juries, the public sentiment was also split on whether she was guilty of her crimes. After the 3rd trial, it was presumed that Louisa Collins would be released. Remarkably, however, a 4th trial was ordered, and this time she would again be prosecuted for the poisoning of her second husband, Michael Collins. The 4th trial of Louisa Collins commenced on the 6th of December 1888 at the Central Criminal Court in Sydney, and followed the same format as the previous ones, with testimony from the same witnesses. However, this time the prosecution were able to establish that the company where the deceased had worked did not use arsenic in their everyday activities, so Michael Collins would not have come into contact with the poison at his workplace. At 12 p.m. on Saturday the 8th of December 1888, the judge summed up the case, and the jury then retired to consider the verdict. 2 hours later, they returned, and when the judge asked if they found the defendant guilty or not guilty, the jury foreman replied, "Guilty." There was a gasp in the courtroom before the judge turned to the defendant and asked if she had anything to say. She replied that she did not. The judge then sentenced Louisa Collins to death by hanging. The newspapers and the people of New South Wales seemed divided on the verdict, but most agreed that it was somewhat inevitable that the court would eventually find Louisa guilty. Some newspapers pointed out that after 3 trials, in which a total of 36 men had heard the case and were unable to reach a verdict, it seemed unfair that she should be hanged. They considered that any evidence pointing to her guilt was circumstantial. The state government had been able to throw unlimited resources at the case, whereas the defendant had been unable to pay for her own legal counsel and was represented in each trial by a defence team who did not receive any payment. Just before Christmas, Sir Ninian Melville stood up in the New South Wales Parliament, expressing his concerns over the sentence. This started a debate in the chamber, but the law stated that the crime for murder was punishable by death, and Mrs. Collins had been found guilty of that crime, so unless there was a change in the law, she would be hanged. The case still fascinated the public, and the newspapers continued to print stories about the trial and the evidence involved. It was suggested that Louisa's children had been guided by the prosecution about what to say on the witness stand. At the first trial, her teenage son had told the court that he could not recall any occasion that he had seen his parents arguing, but his testimony changed in the 4th trial when he stated that they had sometimes argued when his mother drank. The one thing that people struggled to understand was that the life of Michael Collins was not insured, so Louisa had no motive to poison him and had no financial gain by his death. The prosecution had also never been able to provide any evidence that she had ever purchased any arsenic other than the box of Rough on Rats that, like so many people at the time, she kept in the kitchen. Louisa always denied poisoning her husbands and believed that after being tried 4 times, she would be reprieved and her sentence commuted. But on the 8th of January 1889, Louisa Collins was hanged at Darlinghurst Prison. She was 41 years old and the last woman to be hanged in the Australian state of New South Wales. The next case is from 1870s USA. Laura Hunt was born on the 22nd of June, 1837, in the small town of Holly Springs in Mississippi. Her family moved around a lot, as Laura's father did not have a steady job and would travel to wherever he could find work. Eventually they ended up in New Orleans. She was a very pretty girl with a charming nature, and in 1853, when she was 16 years old, she married a gentleman named William Stone, who worked as an alcohol dealer. He was 20 years older than Laura, but a year later In 1854, he died, leaving Laura a 17-year-old widow. Following her husband's death, Laura enrolled in a school to train to become a teacher. Before she finished her studies, she married again, this time to a man named Thomas Grayson. However, he proved to be a poor choice of husband. He would often drink and was sometimes violent. Within 6 months of getting married, Laura had had enough and started divorce proceedings. Along with her mother, she left Mississippi and set up home in California, settling in San Francisco. They stayed there for a short time before moving on to Shasta, where Laura met the county sheriff named William Fair. Again, he was significantly older than her, but he was a very respectable and charming gentleman who worked as an attorney. They married, and Laura gave birth to a daughter, who they named Lillian Lorraine. William decided it would be better for his wife and child if they all lived in San Francisco. They moved to the city, but life there was not quite as easy as he had imagined. He found it hard to establish his practice. His income diminished, and it became increasingly more difficult to provide for his family. William Fair committed suicide in December 1861. Laura was now 24 years old and had been married 3 times, twice widowed and once divorced. William did not leave a fortune in his will, but with the money she inherited, she moved to Sacramento, where she purchased a boarding house, which she planned to run with the assistance of her mother. Unbeknown to Laura, Sacramento did not have many visitors at the time, as the state government was in recess. She struggled to make any money, and faced with large debts, she was left with little choice other than to find a job. She landed a role as an actress at the McGuire Opera House in San Francisco. She was by all accounts a very good actress, but when the production finished, she decided not to continue with her acting career and instead left California and headed to Nevada, where she opened a boarding house in Virginia City. Her arrival coincided with a large discovery of silver ore located under the eastern slope of Mount Davidson, close to Virginia City. This was the first major discovery of silver ore in the United States and sparked a silver rush of prospectors to the area, all trying to stake their claims. As the mining camps started to grow, the city became a bustling commercial centre. Laura and her mother owned the 37-room Tahoe House Hotel. Business boomed, and Laura, with her youthful looks and elegant manner, became a well-known and well-liked figure in the city. One of the many people who travelled to Virginia City to try and make some quick money was a 47-year-old San Francisco lawyer and a former California state legislator named Alexander Crittenden. He was originally from Lexington in Kentucky and had graduated from the West Point Military Academy. He remained in the army for about a year before he left and started to work in the railroad business. He married and moved to Texas, where he studied to become an attorney. Alexander was from a wealthy and well-connected family, so he was soon admitted to the bar, and then in 1852 he moved to California. Success seemed to come easily for him. He started his own law firm and was elected to the state legislature, on which he served for 4 years, eventually becoming the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. After he finished his political career, he returned to San Francisco and carried on working in his law firm. But now, with 7 children and the thoughts of the large amounts of money that the silver mines were generating, Alexander Crittenden decided that he would very much benefit financially if he went to Virginia City and set up his own law practice. He arrived in 1864 and rented a room at the very nice Tahoe House Hotel, owned by Mrs. Laura Fair. He was tall, handsome, and articulate, and the young, free-spirited Laura paid him a lot of attention. Soon they started to spend evenings together, and then nights. Other hotel residents would whisper that Alexander Crittenden was a very special guest, and within a few months of first meeting, Laura and Alexander would walk around the city streets together and declare that they were both very much in love. Laura had been married 3 times and was very keen that the new man in her life make her his wife. She pressured Alexander into marrying her, constantly asking him when they would legally marry. At the time, society drew a sharp distinction between married and unmarried women, and Laura was keen that she preserved her good reputation. Alexander agreed to marry her, but put off any wedding dates. He would tell her that he'd just had a few things to sort out first, and try to buy himself a few more weeks before she would bring the subject up again. His practice started to prosper. He would travel back to California to visit his family, but life suddenly changed when in early 1865, his wife named Clara insisted that she and the children join him in Nevada. Now he had a problem, as his mistress and his wife were going to be living in the same city. This was not San Francisco, with a population of 150,000, where it would have been easier to keep secrets from Clara. Virginia City was a lot smaller. The population was 25,000, and both he and Laura had become well-known residents and had never disguised their feelings for each other. He had no choice but to tell Laura that he was married and that his wife and children would be joining him in Virginia City. Laura was very upset by the revelation. She had wondered if Alexander had been entirely truthful with her, but she had been so infatuated with him, she took him at his word. He insisted that he wanted to be with her and promised to get a divorce. However, when Clara arrived, he rented a nice house for all his family to live in, and also kept his room at the hotel. When his wife questioned him as to why he needed to keep the room, he told her that it was very important to do so for business reasons. He would now spend his days with Laura and his evenings with his wife. He became very adept at moving between the hotel and the house and would tell both ladies exactly what they wanted to hear. He was reluctant to give up Laura and kept on promising to divorce his wife, but he had young children, a successful company, and a very good reputation. He was very well aware that abandoning his wife and children to become the fourth husband of Laura Fair would be very much frowned upon by the prominent social circle he operated in, and would only have a detrimental effect on his business. For the next 5 years, Alexander managed to keep his mistress and his wife apart, while Laura would keep on asking when he was going to divorce and marry her. It seemed that Clara Crittenden was unaware of her husband's infidelity. Alexander was a skilled attorney. He had many clients, which included wealthy individuals and relatively large companies. As his Virginia City law firm had become established, he started to spend time working at his principal law practice back in San Francisco. During this time, when he was traveling between both cities, rumors started to surface that he had a mistress. In an attempt to end all the speculation, he insisted that Laura Fair was nothing more than an acquaintance that he had known for a number of years, as she was the owner of the Tahoe House Hotel. It soon became very apparent that if Alexander wanted to operate a law practice in both Nevada and California, he would not be able to keep his wife and a mistress. Eventually he gave in to Laura's demands and told her that he would divorce Clara. He said he would do this in Indiana, as the courts were more lenient there. He instructed her to travel to New York, where he would meet her so they could travel together to Indiana. As usual, Laura believed his every word and waited for him. But Alexander never arrived, and eventually Laura received a letter telling her that a financial issue had meant that he was unable to travel. She was incensed, but a few weeks later, he persuaded her to meet him in the beautiful and very fashionable town of White Sulphur Springs. Here they again announced their undying love for each other. The relationship continued. Laura moved back to San Francisco along with her mother and daughter. Alexander would visit her and still tell her that he would eventually divorce Clara. But by 1870, Laura had grown tired of his empty promises. The couple argued more frequently, and she wondered if she had wasted the last 6 years with a man who had deceived her. She was now 33 years old and was still often approached by gentlemen very keen to court her, one of whom was a very elegant man named Jesse Snyder. They had a brief relationship before he became her fourth husband. On learning that Laura had married, Alexander was distraught. He wrote her a string of letters proclaiming his love. In one letter he wrote, "I am wretched, insufferably, infinitely wretched. I have no heart or mind for anything. I can think of nothing but you." When he met her again, they agreed that they had to be together and both promised to get a divorce. Laura's divorce was finalised on the 5th of October 1870, and now she was convinced that at last she would be with the man she loved. She sold some of her furniture and prepared herself to move to Alexander's house. She was aware that his wife Clara and the children had been sent east, and she presumed that that was in order for her to come to terms with the divorce. But Alexander Crittenden was not going to divorce his wife. In fact, he had not even discussed any such thing with her, and when Laura learnt that Clara would soon be returning from her trip, and her husband was going to meet her, she was enraged. She went to Kearney Street and asked a gunsmith to exchange the Colt revolver she owned for a smaller and more modern 4-barrel pistol, one that could easily be concealed in a lady's bag. She learned that Clara and the 3 children who had accompanied her on the trip would be returning on November the 3rd and arriving at the railway station in Oakland. When the day came, Laura dressed herself completely in black, including a veil to cover her face, and slipped the newly acquired pistol into her bag. She then took a boat to Oakland, where she patiently waited for the train to arrive. She noticed Alexander sitting nearby. If he saw her, he would have no idea of who this mysterious lady was. She did not look out of place, as at the time many women who had been recently widowed would wear black dresses and a full-length black veil when out in public places. When the train pulled up at the station, Clara Crittenden and the 3 children disembarked, and Alexander walked towards them. Laura noticed that everything seemed normal. Clara took his arm, and they made their way to Oakland Pier to board the ferry boat to take them back to San Francisco. Obscured behind her veil, Laura sat close by and carefully observed the couple. Then suddenly, just as the boat was leaving the port, she walked over to Alexander. When he saw the strange veiled lady approach, he stood up. As she got closer, she took the pistol from her bag and shot him once in the chest. Then she calmly walked away. Alexander fell to the floor. The crew of the boat rushed to his aid. Another went to Laura, who was by now sitting down and was quite still and not making a sound. The crew member disarmed her, and when the boat arrived in San Francisco, Laura Fair was placed under arrest. She did not deny shooting the unarmed gentleman on the boat. She simply said that the man had ruined her life and the life of her daughter, and she had intended to kill him. Alexander Crittenden was not in fact dead. He was taken to his home, where he lived for another 48 hours, before eventually succumbing to his injuries. On the day of his funeral, the federal, state and municipal courts adjourned, and it was at the time one of the largest funerals ever held in San Francisco. Laura Fair's trial began on March 27th, 1871, and proved to be a sensation. As the crime had been reported in all the newspapers, it had come to the attention of many prominent campaigners in the movement for women's rights, and they tried to make it more of a question about 19th century American society and morality, and less about the actual fact that Laura Fair had shot Alexander Crittenden. Laura's attorneys claimed that at the time of the incident, she was not in fact sane and had suffered partial intellectual insanity and partial moral insanity. They eloquently described a charming, caring lady whose state of mind had been corrupted by years of emotional abuse from the victim. Laura herself told the court that she had no memory of what she had done. The prosecution painted a very different picture of a defendant. They said that she had no history of mental instability and had meticulously planned her crime, She had purchased a new gun, gone to the train station, followed her victim onto the boat, and shot him. It was a crime that was obviously planned by a very logically thinking person. Other witnesses said that Laura pursued men of a certain financial and social status, and that money was the motivator behind all the men she courted. One witness described her as a loose woman, while Clara Crittenden innocently informed the court that she was a selfless, loving wife, and Laura Fair was a calculating and manipulative woman who for years had tried to persuade her husband to leave her and break up their family. When the trial ended, the jury retired to deliberate. It was thought that this may take some time, as the trial had been going on for nearly a month, but in fact the jury returned in less than an hour and delivered the verdict of guilty. Laura was sentenced to be hanged on July the 28th. There was a mixed reaction in San Francisco, but the majority of people thought the verdict was just. The defence lodged an appeal, and while it was being considered, Laura's execution date was suspended. Eventually the verdict was overturned on technicalities, and a new trial was ordered, which commenced in September 1872. Laura attended court every day, dressed entirely in black, and wore a black veil. When the trial ended, she was found not guilty due to temporary insanity. The verdict caused a sensation in San Francisco. Most people seemed to think that even if Laura didn't hang for her crime, she should at least serve a relatively long time in prison. There were those, however, who thought the verdict was just, and that Laura's mind had been so unfairly corrupted by a man who had acted very dishonourably towards her. Now a free woman, Laura continued to live in San Francisco, and as time passed, she became a far less prominent figure and could walk into the city without being noticed. She died on the 19th of October, 1919, aged 82. The fourth case is from 20th century Scotland. Oscar Josef Leshzina was born into a Jewish family on the 8th of January 1872 in the city of Oppen, which at the time formed part of the German Empire. At the end of the Second World War in 1945, Oppen became part of Poland and returned to its original Slavic name of Opole. It was a nice place to grow up, situated on the banks of the Oder River. For hundreds of years, the city had been very important for commerce and trade, and in the late 19th century, it had a population of around 12,000 people. His father worked as a baker, and young Oscar enjoyed a modest upbringing and a relatively good education. In 1893, when he was 21 years old, he decided to leave his homeland and travelled to England. Many young men had illegally emigrated from Germany in order to avoid military service. While many went to the United States, Britain was also considered a favourable destination. Not only was the country one of the leading economies in Europe, it was also a prominent industrial power, offering good employment opportunities. There was also a large Jewish community. He settled in London, but instead of making his way in a professional capacity, he worked as a bookmaker. At the time, gambling was considered an important part of Victorian working-class leisure, and popular amongst the residents of the East End of the city. Betting houses had existed in London for many years. They accepted small bets and were quick to pay out any winners. This allowed repeated betting on race days, so people would often reinvest their winnings in bets that they subsequently lost. When the betting houses were made illegal, they moved into pubs and into the city streets. They would hire runners to collect bets and pay the winners. There were also lookouts who would warn if there were any policemen in the area. Oscar worked under many aliases, most notably Oscar Anderson, but he eventually adopted the name Slater, which he used for more official purposes. His work, however, did mean that he became known to the police, and in 1896 he was arrested and charged for alleged malicious wounding. This was followed with him being arrested again in 1897 on the charge of assault. On both occasions he was acquitted. In 1899, he moved to Scotland, settling in the country's capital city, Edinburgh. He always dressed well and gave the impression that he was a fine gentleman, claiming to be a dentist and somewhat of an expert in precious stones. But Oscar seemed to be earning his living by gambling. After 2 years in Edinburgh, he moved on to Glasgow. Here he became known to police, as they suspected that he was running an illegal betting operation. He had been married, but his wife was a heavy drinker, so he left her and started a relationship with a young French lady named Miss André Antoine. While Oscar was taking bets and gambling, she would earn her money by entertaining gentlemen callers. The Street Betting Act was passed in 1906, but many working class people continued to place regular bets with bookmakers in their houses or on the streets, and although this was now illegal, it was something that the police seemed reluctant to enforce. Miss Marion Gilchrist was an elderly lady who lived in a spacious first-floor apartment at 15 Queen's Terrace, West Princess Street in Glasgow. She was a very wealthy lady, having inherited a large fortune from her father. In 1908, she celebrated her 83rd birthday. She lived with her housemaid, a young lady named Miss Helen Lambie. In the early evening of Monday the 21st of December 1908, a gentleman named Mr. Arthur Adams, who lived with his sisters in the apartment directly below Miss Gilchrist, heard 3 knocks on his ceiling. He had previously told Miss Gilchrist that if she was ever in need of any help, to knock on the floor. Encouraged by his sisters, he went to see if Miss Gilchrist was in need of some sort of assistance. He hurried up the stairs, only to find that the door of Miss Gilchrist's apartment was locked. He rang the bell, but no one answered. Somewhat strangely, he could hear faint noises coming from inside. Thinking that everything was probably in order, he returned back to his apartment. To Mr. Adams' surprise, his sisters told him to immediately go back and check on their elderly neighbour. As he walked back towards the apartment, he saw Miss Gilchrist's maid, Miss Helen Lambie, on the stairs. She had gone into the street to buy her mistress a newspaper, something she did on most evenings. Miss Lambie unlocked the door, and along with Mr. Adams, entered the apartment. A well-dressed gentleman appeared, and hurriedly rushed out of the door, down the stairs, and into the street. This seemed very unusual. Miss Lambie had not been aware that her mistress was expecting a visitor, and she herself had only been gone a few minutes. Miss Lambie went into the kitchen, and then into one of the bedrooms, but there was no sign of her mistress. She then entered the dining room, where she was confronted with a horrific sight of Miss Gilchrist laying face down on the floor. Blood was coming from her head. Mr. Adams rushed into the street for assistance. He fetched his doctor and alerted the police. Miss Gilchrist, however, was dead. The doctor confirmed that she had died from blows to the head. The police examined the scene. It was strange. There was no sign of a forced entry, which suggested that the attacker may have been known to the deceased. There was a box of matches in the bedroom, and a gas light had been lit. Papers were scattered about, and a small box had been forced open. The police suspected that the motive for the crime had been robbery, although Miss Gilchrist's valuable jewellery collection had not been taken, and it seemed that only a crescent-shaped diamond brooch was missing. The police asked Miss Lambie and Mr. Adams for information about the gentleman they had seen leave the apartment, and they gave a similar, but not identical description. As news of the murder of a defenceless 83-year-old lady started to spread across the city, the police realised that they would have to catch the culprit as soon as possible. 2 days later, on the 23rd of December, a young 14-year-old girl named Miss Mary Barrowman came forward. She claimed that she had also seen the same gentleman leave the building. She told the police that he was in such a hurry that he nearly bumped into her. However, her description was very different to the description that was given by Miss Lambie and Mr. Adams. The following day, another witness came forward and informed the police that a gentleman who lived at St. George's Road, close to the home of Miss Gilchrist, was in possession of a pawn ticket for a diamond brooch. The police knew that a brooch had been taken during the attack. The gentleman's name was Oscar Lechsiner, but he mainly went by the name Oscar Slater. He was a 37-year-old German and was known to earn his living in a very dubious manner. The police visited the home of Mr. Slater, but were told by the maid that on the 21st of December, Oscar had been at home. The maid also informed the detectives that Mr. Slater had left Glasgow with his mistress, Miss André Antoine. She said that they had travelled to Liverpool and boarded the ship Lusitania, bound for New York. They had not booked their passage under their real names. Instead, they had used the alias of Mr. and Mrs. Otto Sandow. The police continued to investigate and soon discovered that the brooch at the pawn shop had actually been there for some time and was different to the brooch that had been stolen. However, they still considered that Mr. Oscar Slater was a credible suspect. A warrant for his arrest was issued. The New York police were contacted and an extradition application was made. The Lusitania arrived in New York on the 2nd of January 1909, and Mr. Oscar Slater was arrested and taken to Tombs prison. Thinking that the police had resolved the case and caught the murderer, the Scottish newspapers published a picture of the suspect. This was followed by more witnesses coming forward to tell the police that they had seen the same gentleman in the early evening of the 21st of December in the vicinity of West Princess Street. However, it did seem strange that these witnesses had only come forward after the suspect's picture had been printed and a reward of £200 had been offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Mr. Adams, Miss Lambie, and Miss Mary Barrowman were asked to accompany detectives to New York. When they arrived, the two young ladies identified Oscar Slater as a gentleman they had witnessed leaving Miss Gilchrist's property. Mr. Adams was not so convinced that he was a gentleman who he had seen. Mr. Oscar Slater was advised that the extradition application would probably not be successful, but he felt very distressed that he had been accused of such a terrible crime and voluntarily agreed to return to Scotland in order to clear his name. The press reported the news that he would be returning to Glasgow. They devoted columns about his life, informing their readers that he had left Germany in order to avoid military service. They added that he was Jewish, in the knowledge that at the time there had been an increase in anti-Jewish sentiment. Instead of the press remaining somewhat impartial, they seemed convinced that Oscar was guilty. The fact that he had returned to Scotland voluntarily did little to convince anyone that he may be innocent. The police searched his luggage and discovered a hammer. They thought that this may have been the murder weapon, although some experts advised that the hammer was too small to have inflicted the wounds on Miss Gilchrist. In February 1909, witnesses who had allegedly seen a gentleman around the Queen's Terrace area on the 21st of December 1908 were asked to attend an identity parade. Most picked out Oscar. All, however, had previously seen his picture in the newspapers. Mr. Oscar Slater was charged with murder. The trial of Oscar Slater began in Edinburgh on the 3rd of May 1909. Miss Lambie and Miss Barrowman were both called as witnesses and were able to inform the court that the defendant was a gentleman who they had seen that night. Mr. Adams, however, who had been unable to identify Mr. Slater as being the person he had seen leave Miss Gilchrist's apartment, was not called to give evidence. The prosecution outlined the way in which the defendant conducted his daily affairs and created the impression that he was a dubious character who made his way in life by illegal and immoral means. The public was fascinated by the case, and as the trial continued, they became more convinced of Mr. Oscar Slater's guilt. The prosecution, however, were unable to produce any physical evidence. There were no fingerprints or blood-stained clothes. There was also the fact that only a brooch had been taken and the rest of the valuable jewellery collection had been left. Why would Oscar Slater have been looking for a document from an elderly lady that he had probably never previously met? There was also the alibi provided by his mistress and the maid, but the prosecution reminded the jury that Miss André Antoine was a lady who earned her money by entertaining gentlemen callers, and therefore she was not someone whose testimony could be trusted. The press and the public seemed to have overlooked much of the evidence. The fact that the brooch in the pawn shop was not the one that had belonged to Miss Gilchrist. The trip to New York had been arranged long before the crime had taken place. Miss Barrowman's initial description of the man she had seen on the night of the murder was significantly different by that given by Miss Lambie and Mr. Adams. The small hammer found could not have been the murder weapon, and that the prosecution were unable to explain how a defendant could have entered the apartment, as there was no sign of a forced entry. But in the eyes of the press and the public, Oscar Slater was guilty. When the trial ended, the judge summed up the case and said A man of this kind has not the presumption of innocence in his favour. When the jury returned, they found the defendant guilty by a majority of 9-6, 5 thinking the case not proven, and 1 believing Oscar to be not guilty. The judge sentenced Oscar Slater to death. The date of his execution was set for the 27th of May 1909. There was no right to appeal a court decision, so the defence lawyers organised a petition which soon gained over 20,000 signatures. The Secretary of State for Scotland, Lord Petland, came under pressure to commute the sentence, and eventually he did. Just 2 days before Oscar was due to be hanged, his sentence was changed to life in prison. Despite the press and the public being very much against Oscar Slater during his trial, as he began to serve his sentence, there were those who started to question his guilt. In 1910, a Scottish lawyer and criminologist named William Rufford published the trial of Oscar Slater, which highlighted the weak case that the prosecution had presented against him. 2 years later, in 1912, the author of the Sherlock Holmes book, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, published a document named The Case of Oscar Slater. Here he concluded that Oscar should be pardoned and released. He considered that the murderer had been looking for specific documents, such as Miss Gilchrist's will, and robbery had not been the motive for the crime. This would explain why only a brooch was taken from the property. It was believed that Miss Gilchrist had recently changed her will, leaving out many of her family members. In 1914, the politician Thomas Mackinnon Wood ordered a private inquiry into the case. A detective named John Thompson Trench, who had worked on the investigation in 1908, provided information which had allegedly been deliberately concealed from the trial by the police. However, he was dismissed from the force and prosecuted on charges from which he was eventually acquitted. The inquiry also found that the original trial of Oscar Slater had not been prejudiced. Time passed. The First World War started in 1914 and ended in 1918. The 1920s arrived with advances in communication and industry. The case of Mr. Oscar Slater was now barely mentioned, and he remained in Peterhead prison, telling anyone who would listen that he was an innocent man. There were those, however, who still thought that he had suffered a miscarriage of justice. In 1924, John Thompson Trench again spoke about the investigation. He said that on the night of the murder, Miss Lambie had named a gentleman who she had seen leave the apartment, and the name she gave was not Oscar Slater, but someone named A.B. However, when the police received the lead about the pawned brooch, it was decided that Oscar Slater was the main suspect, and resources were focused on his arrest. In 1925, Oscar managed to get a note smuggled out of the prison by a fellow inmate, which was passed on to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The note asked that he continue to fight on his behalf. Conan Doyle applied to the Secretary of State for Oscar Slater's release. This request, however, was refused. Over the next 2 years, Oscar was occasionally mentioned in the press, but the public had largely forgotten about his case. In 1927, the author, William Park, had a book published named The Truth About Oscar Slater, and the case was again reported in the media. After examining all the evidence, the author believed that the person who murdered Miss Gilchrist was probably known to her, and that is why there had been no forced entry into her apartment, as the murderer had been invited inside. He considered that the assailant wanted a document, which may have been a will. He thought that the murder may not have been premeditated, but as the assailant was unable to attain the document, he may have argued with and injured the elderly lady, and worried that she would report him to the police, he panicked and murdered her. This was the same conclusion that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had come to 15 years earlier. The contents of the book and the subsequent renewed press interest led to the Solicitor General for Scotland, Alexander Monroe McRoberts, to conclude that Oscar Slater's conviction was no longer proven. On November the 8th, 1927, he issued the following statement: Oscar Slater has now completed more than 18.5 years of his life sentence, and I have felt justified in deciding to authorise his release on licence as soon as suitable arrangements can be made. 6 days later, Oscar Slater was released from prison. On the 8th of June 1928, the case was appealed in front of 5 judges. The original conviction was then quashed on the grounds that the judge in 1909 had failed to direct the jury properly. Oscar received only £6,000 in compensation. In 1935, he married a local Scottish lady of German descent named Lena Wilhelmina Shad. They settled in the seaside town of Ayr, where he worked selling and repairing antiques. As a German, he and his wife were interned for a brief time at the start of World War II, although he had not been back to Germany for many years and was no longer a German citizen. Oscar Slater died in 1948 of natural causes. Over the years, there have been many theories as to who was responsible for the murder of Marion Gilchrist, but it is a case that remains unsolved. For the fifth and final case, we go to late 1870s USA. Mary Elizabeth Stannard was born in 1856 in Madison, New Haven County, Connecticut. As a young girl, she was considered to be quite shy. She lived with her father named Charles, her stepmother, and half-sister named Susan. Mary was a helpful child. She would tidy the house and do all her chores without any fuss. She had some education, but struggled at school. When she was a teenager, she would work when she could, usually helping to clean in the larger houses of Madison. She was known to most of the residents of the town, mainly because of her cheerful demeanour. It was noticed that she would often be approached by young men, all of who appeared to be eager to make her acquaintance, but everyone believed Mary to be a sweet and innocent young lady. So it was a surprise when in 1875, people started to wonder if Miss Mary Stannard was with child. On the 7th of April 1876, when she was 19 years old, Mary gave birth to a baby boy, who she named William Victor Stannard. Soon it seemed that all the 1,600 residents of Madison knew about her situation, and it was rumoured that the father was a young married man who lived in the town of Wallingford. Whoever he was, he had no intention of leaving his wife and marrying Mary. At the time, a woman who gave birth to a baby whilst unmarried was considered immoral, and with it came a certain social stigma. Mary, however, was looked upon with far more sympathy, as although she was always courteous and polite, and did her best to help people when she was able, many of the residents of Madison thought her to be quite a simple-minded young lady. Mary cared for her baby in the small house, and she was often visited by friends and relatives, but she wanted to be able to provide for her child herself. She was not prepared to stay at home and accept the charity of others. Reverend Herbert H. Hayden was a 27-year-old Methodist minister who had been appointed to the village of Rockland, some 10 miles from Madison. He had married his wife named Rosa on the 8th of August 1871, and in 1873, Rosa gave birth to a daughter. She was a pleasant, hard-working young lady who was employed as a schoolteacher. She was intelligent, but considered to be of a delicate constitution. She had suffered terrible losses in her life, as within 1 year of her marriage, her mother, sister, and brother all died of consumption. Reverend Hayden was born in 1850 in Boston, Massachusetts. He was the son of a shoemaker, and when he was 4 years old, the family moved a few miles away to Dighton, where his father opened a country store, which became a very successful business. He attended school until the age of 16, when he took employment as a carpenter's apprentice, but after 2 years, he received his calling to work as a pastor. He claimed that he did not want to undertake this work, and prayed that he would not have to take it up, but the calling was too strong, so he studied to become a preacher. In 1876, he was asked to become the pastor in the village of Rockland. He duly obliged, and along with his wife and 2 children, moved to a small farm nearby. Things were going well for him, and his reputation grew, so much so that in August 1877, he was asked if he would also conduct the Sunday service in the town of Madison. In the winter of 1877, he was offered a teaching position in Madison. This meant that he would have to leave his family on Saturday afternoons to travel there. He would then preach on Sundays and work in his teaching position all week before returning home to his wife and children on Fridays. It was a difficult time for the preacher's wife, Mrs. Rosa Hayden. She taught classes from the farmhouse and was finding it quite difficult to cope with her work and looking after their children, and by now she was pregnant again She also did not like being left alone at night. Concerned for his wife, Reverend Hayden arranged for her to have some help. So in December 1877, he hired Miss Mary Elizabeth Stannard, a young lady he was already acquainted with, as he had visited the family and encouraged them to attend church. Mary's father had also borrowed tools from the Reverend. It was agreed that Mary would help Mrs. Hayden during the week. She'd arrive at the house on Saturday afternoons, just before Mrs. Hayden's husband left, and she would stay there until the Friday evening, when Reverend Hayden returned from Madison. The situation lasted until the end of February 1878, when the school where Reverend Hayden was teaching closed, and he returned to live with his family. However, people had begun to suspect that the Reverend's interest in young Mary Stannard was more than just a concerned pastor who had employed her to assist his wife. He had often been seen out in her company, and there was gossip in the town that the pair may have been involved in something more sinister. Although Mary was no longer engaged in employment at the Haydens' house, they asked her if she would look after their 2 children one evening in March 1878, as they were obliged to attend an oyster supper given in benefit of the Rockland Church. The supper took place very close to the house. In fact, it was less than 230 feet away, so at around 9 p.m, Reverend Hayden returned to check on the children. He was only gone for a short time, and everything was in order. He then returned to the oyster supper. In August 1878, Mary went to stay with a friend named Miss Jane Studley, who lived in Guilford, Connecticut. Mary had previously worked on Mr. Studley's farm, and both Mr. and Mrs. Studley considered Mary to be a pleasant young lady who had been unfortunate to have previously found herself in poor circumstances. Mr. Studley noticed that Mary was in very low spirits and asked his wife to speak to her. After some persuasion, a tearful Mary told of how she had been intimate with another gentleman and feared that she was again with child. She was most troubled by this, as she knew that having a second child whilst unmarried would bring shame onto her family, and she was sure that this time the good people of Madison would not be so sympathetic towards her situation. Mrs. Studley asked Mary who was responsible for this unfortunate circumstance, but Mary was very reluctant to say. Eventually, however, she tearfully revealed that the person was Reverend Hayden. She said that it happened in March, while she was looking after the Reverend and Mrs. Hayden's children so they could attend the oyster supper. She said that the Reverend had returned during the evening and they had been intimate. He then went back to the supper. She believed that she was by now 5 months pregnant. Mrs. Studley observed Mary and came to the conclusion that she was indeed with child. Mary wrote a letter to her half-sister. In it she included a letter which she asked her to send on to the Reverend. In this, she asked him to escort her to New Haven for a termination. She wrote that afterwards she would return to the house of Mr. and Mrs. Studley until she was suitably recovered. However, Mr. Studley said he would not have any part of it, and the next day he accompanied Mary back to her father's small house. By this time, she had decided that the letter she had written to Reverend Hayden should not be sent, and asked her half-sister to destroy it. Mary told her that she was anxious to speak to him in person to make sure that everything was all right. On Monday the 2nd of September, Mary met with Reverend Hayden. He told her not to worry and that he would take care of the situation. He said he would purchase some medicine that would make the problem disappear. He then arranged to meet her the following day at 2:30, next to the Big Rock, a boulder that was so large it had been given a name. It was a place where wild blackberries grew and was surrounded by large trees. Her father came back to the house at about 4:30 in the afternoon and noticed that Mary had not returned. He knew that she had gone to gather blackberries, but she should have been back by now, so he headed out to find her. He walked down the path, calling out her name. At about 5:30, Mr. Charles Stannard came across the horrifying sight of his daughter laying dead on the ground. Her arms were folded over her chest, her clothing was not disarranged, and there was no indication that she had been in any type of struggle. Her bonnet had been placed neatly by her sides. There were no blackberries in the pail that she had brought with her. Mr. Stannard quickly ran to fetch help. He banged on the door of Mr. Francis Mills, who alerted his 2 sons, and they all immediately went to the place where Mary was lying. News of the murder then started to spread throughout the town, and within a short time, more than a dozen people had gathered at the remote spot around the body, one of who was a Methodist minister Reverend Herbert H. Hayden. A search was made for the weapon, but nothing was found. By now it was getting dark, and it had started to rain. Mary's body was carried to her father's house, and the local justice was notified. Rumours of how this terrible tragedy had happened soon started to spread throughout the town of Madison and beyond. At first, there was speculation that Mary may have taken her own life, but her arms had been folded. There was a blow on her head, and she had been stabbed in the throat. No weapon had been seen nearby, and there were bruises on her wrists. The justice ordered that a post-mortem be undertaken, which took place at 3 a.m. on Wednesday the 4th of September, and was carried out by Dr. Rufus W. Matthewson. He concluded that the cause of death was caused by being hit in the head with a blunt object and a stab wound to the neck. The death of poor Mary Stannard was the only thing that the residents of Madison were talking about. All day on the Wednesday and Thursday, people would stop in the streets to see if anyone had heard if there had been any new occurrences in the investigation. But in truth, the only name that was being mentioned was the name of the Reverend Herbert H. Hayden. When Mary's half-sister told the justices the story of how Mary had arranged to meet the pastor to discuss her condition, Deputy Sheriff Hull was instructed to arrest him. The Reverend's wife had only recently given birth to their third child. Nevertheless, he was taken into custody. The following day, newspaper reporters flocked to Madison and attempted to interview the suspect. However, he was unwilling to speak about the crime for which he was accused, only to say that he was not guilty. The crime became the news story of the time. The Hartford Courant printed in its columns, "Of his guilt as the case appears now, there can be very little doubt, and it looks as though he was led through fright to commit the murder, and yet did it in so bungling a manner as to make it almost impossible for him to escape suspicion and arrest." On Tuesday the 10th of September, a hearing began at the Madison Town Hall. Mary Stannard's vital organs had been preserved in glass jars. In a strange twist, it was revealed that at the time of her death, Mary had not been pregnant at all. The hearing was also told that a large amount of arsenic was found in her body, enough in fact to have killed up to 20 people. The hearing lasted for 2 weeks, and Reverend Herbert Hayden was found to be innocent of all charges. Many of the people of Madison had found it hard to believe that the Reverend could be guilty of such a crime, and when he left court, he was met by some of his cheering supporters. Later, however, evidence emerged that after meeting Mary on the 3rd of September, the Reverend had travelled to Middletown, where he had purchased an ounce of arsenic, on the pretence that he wanted to get rid of rats that were a nuisance in his house. The poison was wrapped and labelled, but the purchaser's name had not been taken. However, as he left the chemist shop, he was approached by a gentleman who attended his church and inquired as to the health of his wife and newborn baby. With this new evidence, Reverend Hayden was again arrested and taken to New Haven jail. He was then charged and stayed in jail to await his trial for the murder of Miss Mary Elizabeth Stannard. The trial of Reverend Herbert H. Hayden began on the 7th of October 1879, more than a year after the murder had been committed. And just like the first hearing, it was a contentious affair. All of the witnesses who had appeared previously were ordered to attend. The defence floated a number of alternative suspects, including Mary's father, Charles. Another name mentioned was 60-year-old Ben Stevens, who was well known to the family. There had been suggestions that on the Friday following the murder, Mr. Stevens' wife was washing his trousers and found so much blood on them that she fainted. When reporters had questioned her about this, she had told them that she had indeed fainted, but due to exhaustion from working so hard that day, and assured the reporters that she had not found any blood on her husband's trousers. The one thing that was puzzling was the arsenic. The defendant had admitted purchasing an ounce of arsenic for the purpose of getting rid of rats in his home. He'd even told the authorities that it had not been used and was still in his barn. The authorities had found it exactly where he had said it was. It was still wrapped, and none had been used. However, Professor Samuel Johnson of Yale Medical College was able to determine that the arsenic found in the barn was different to that found in Mary's stomach. It was explained to the court that arsenic condenses in 8-sided crystals, which are then ground up with a roller. However, some of the crystals are so small that they remain unbroken. By using a microscope to look in detail at these crystals, the professor was able to conclusively say that the arsenic found in the barn had not been purchased at the same time or from the same store, that the defendant had claimed to have bought the arsenic in order to get rid of rats from his property. However, the arsenic found in Mary's stomach had without doubt been purchased from the store in Middletown. The defence also produced their own witnesses to try and disprove this theory. Although the scientific evidence presented did not prove that the defendant was guilty, it did suggest that he had not told the truth about where he had purchased the arsenic found in his barn. The prosecution informed the court that they believed that the defendant had purchased more arsenic after he had given the arsenic purchased in Middletown to Mary. They claimed he did this in order to try and cover up his crime. The prosecution thought that Mary had taken the arsenic, thinking it to be a quick remedy to end her pregnancy. She became concerned for her safety and tried to run back to her house. In a panic, Reverend Hayden had hit her with a small rock and then cut her throat. The court was shown a pocket knife that belonged to the defendant. However, it was not uncommon to possess such a knife at the time. It was the appearance in the witness box of Reverend Hayden's wife Rosa that resonated most with the jury. In an emotional testimony, she told how she had complete faith in her husband's innocence. The trial lasted for 3 months, and it was not until January 1880 that the jury eventually retired to deliberate the case. But after much consideration, they were unable to reach a verdict. There was instead a hung jury. The trial had taken far longer than anticipated and cost in excess of $30,000. The state was not prepared to finance another trial, especially after learning that only one juror had thought the defendant to be guilty. The others had all been convinced of his innocence, following the testimony of Mrs. Rosa Hayden. A few days later, Reverend Herbert H. Hayden was released. He then returned to his family. For a short time, he continued to preach in the Methodist ministry, but eventually decided to move to New Haven and took up work as a carpenter. He died on the 13th of May 1907, at the age of 57. Money had been raised to help Mary's son William. He continued to live in the area. Ironically, he died in Middletown in 1957, at the age of 81. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. This has been my longest ever video, so I really appreciate it that you made it to the end. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again for the next brief case.